Many believe that Cleopatra was buried with Mark Antony, as she held an obsessive love for him. But is this actually true? There are a lot of reasons to question her love for him along the course of their relationship, especially at or near the end of their lives. Even early on, Antony had abandoned her, pregnant with her twins, perhaps not known, and did not contact her or acknowledge them for the term of his 3-year union with Octavia, Augustus' sister, who he deserted her for in order to please and get favour from Rome and Augustus. Also to consider generally about a mutual grave is that he most likely would have been cremated like Julius Caesar in accordance with Roman tradition. The Battle of Actium against Octavian Augustus, after Antony had linked up with Cleopatra again, having bought her love back, they were sieged almost immediately, in a siege that lasted for months. It is reported that Mark Antony actually feared her at this time on account of her dissatisfaction and anger over the disaster she was a part of. She displayed this when she called for a condemned man and gave him a cup of wine as his last rite. Before he drank it, she dropped a flower from her garland into it in front of all present. Within a short time he dropped dead, poisoned by the flower. Clearly this act was a warning to the commanders, including Antony, of how easily she could kill them, done to shock the generals out of their complacency of this disaster, and a warning to Antony to get himself together. A warning is to say, because I'm feeling close to getting rid of you myself. At the conclusion of the siege, navy battle ensued ahead of an approaching violent storm. Her navy, led by Antony, was predictably losing. Due to Antony's incompetence and Octavian's far more agile warships, this having never been observed or considered in his plans. So she left him to be defeated by Octavian's navy, presumably to be killed or captured. At least he would die in her mind an admirable death in battle, leaving her rid of a man who'd been a disappointment many times before and now flopped in this failed adventure as well, like in Parthia long ago. This then would leave her to negotiate with the victorious Octavian about a workable resolution that she deserved to end their conflict. With the storm approaching, so violent the battle was ceased and Octavian was seasick whilst at anchor. Incidentally, Cleopatra also suffered from seasickness too at times like these. So she retired for Actium. It wasn't her in command anyway, and with her own escort she sailed for home to Egypt. It was not even her war at all, but Antony's, that she was dragged into. So she left him to suffer the consequences of his mishandling of the whole campaign and be rid of him clearly. Antony, possibly a delusional bipolar alcoholic, in his suffering from overconfidence, had led to a lack of strategic tactics right from the start, resulting in the siege. The wind blew to the south, having to be a tailwind to leave. So with little sail up to be safe and comfortable for the Queen, she left. But Antony, blown along in a quick small boat, caught up with Cleopatra's ship. Meantime, she had gone below to strap in for the bad sea conditions with seasickness. Without her knowledge, Antony got on board. She did not find him hiding up in the bow for 3 days when she at last came on deck. And it's surprising she did not have him thrown overboard for his abandoning of his navy and troops. Back in Egypt, in Alexandria, he hid in a house on an estuary away from her, sulking and drinking heavily for a month, whilst she angrily distanced herself from him out of disgust for his cowardice as commander-in-chief for deserting his duties. During this time, she tried to escape to the Dead Sea to return later to negotiate with Octavian, but she was cut off at Napata's border, so now went back to Alexandria, stuck, awaiting Octavian. A month passed by, and on Antony's birthday she forgave him, and now they entered into a suicide pact like Hitler's bunker, all neglecting themselves with too much alcohol, no doubt, to a wretched state in the end. It's believed she attempted to communicate with Octavian many times at this time, but her communications were intercepted or he simply stonewalled her. It's told that he had spies informing him of the two's debilitating health, so he took his time to confront them to finalise the whole affair. He does not appear for 12 months, by which time it is said Cleopatra was literally in a hopeless and wretched state. On his appearance, the two forces faced off to each other, and as Mark Antony let his men out, he noticed Cleopatra's navy right next door to him sail up to Octavian's navy and join them happily, congratulating each other and capitulating. Struck with fear at his realisation, he was shocked her soldiers walked straight ahead and now did likewise, backslapping their opponents and shaking hands. He was left with his motley-sized guard and nothing else. Cleopatra, it seems, had played her cards again like it acted him, finally giving Antony to his chivalrous ending and sparing her the need to dispense with him herself, an act she obviously could not bring herself to do. She effectively handed Antony over to Octavian, ridding herself at last of a man who has destroyed her life. One can only speculate on Antony's condition at this time, but delusional and maybe somewhat intoxicated is not to be dismissed. He challenges Octavian to a duel, but Octavian mocks and laughs at him, totally humiliating him, and most likely chided him to go back to hide behind his girlfriend's shirt tails for protection. Pardon me. He proceeds to do so, and Cleopatra is informed that Octavian has let him go. A frustrated Cleopatra now gets word to Antony that there is no queen to go home to, as she has committed suicide. Totally abandoned, a useless Antony falls on his sword and does himself in also, believing she is dead. Whilst Cleopatra, still alive, has now desperately done her final act to give him his chivalrous ending. What Cleopatra desperately wanted was a meeting at last with Octavian after all his stonewalling, to pass on her will to him, including the fate of her youngest children. Caesarion, Julius Caesar's son, she had sent away, but he does not escape and is found and killed after her death. But the youngest ones, future, she most definitely wants to secure and discuss with Octavian. They were 10 and 6. She also wanted to instruct him of her designs for a memorial, mausoleum, burial place. Octavian must take the role of executor of her will and adopt her children. It is an absolute magnanimous obligation of all victorious leaders going back centuries. Octavian does not capture or kill Cleopatra. To do so to the respected queen, a woman, and the mother of the loved Julius Caesar's son would be condemned back in Rome, but instead places a guard around her compound and neglects her to debilitate even more in her despair. It is recorded that Antony was given a state burial or was cremated. No scholar is totally sure. However, it was normal practice for someone like Antony to be cremated, as was the case with Julius Caesar. It is unlikely that he was buried, but his ashes might have been buried with Cleopatra later in her mausoleum to the south. But before this, Octavian leaves Cleopatra to mourn and grieve, dwell and regret her lapse of sound thinking, and like her in her last actions, including tolerating naively Antony. Believing his delusions that his war would be won because of the advantage of her huge battleships. This situation persisted for about 2 weeks, and whilst Cleopatra sends him messages, he does not reply. A cruel act, I believe. Humiliated and ashamed at her downfall due to her desperate ongoing affair with Antony, including which has led her to let her people of Egypt and the Ptolemy holy line of godly kings and queens down, she declines into an even worse health. Octavian eventually gets a message that Cleopatra is in a desperately grave condition and is threatening suicide. Today is his last chance to give her the audience she rightly deserves. With this, he quickly goes to her shelter and indeed finds a hopelessly weak and wretched woman, sadly. He now spends 2 hours with her, and much is shared and discussed. He leaves, and 2 hours later she is found dead, from poison no doubt, having indeed committed suicide. So what was discussed and agreed upon? As there is no record of the meeting, the best way to know this is to evaluate Octavian's actions after her death, and there are many. It is documented by commentators closer to the time that they did discuss the fate of her children. So what did he do as her executor? The 3 youngest he took back to Italy with him, and on the way met with King Herod the Great on the island of Cyprus. Herod being a close associate of Cleopatra's and a former love, it was rumoured, and possibly even the father of her last son. The daughter Cleopatra Selene he gave an arranged union to Julius Juba II of Mauritania, who was the adopted son of Julius Caesar and half-brother of Octavian's. Not only that, he was one of Octavian's best friends, and she certainly received special treatment. The 2 sons, Alexander Helios and Ptolemy Philadelphus, he had adopted by King Herod, and they became Herod Alexander and Herod Archelaus. The last son being named after his uncle, the husband of Cleopatra's sister, and he also got special treatment. Excuse me. Archelaus went on to become the ethnarch, another word for king, of Israel. When King Herod granted him his throne, the family contested his will to the executor of the will, being Octavian Augustus, who upheld his will to protect Cleopatra's last son as he had promised her. Incidentally, Archelaus had a first wife, daughter of Joseph, King Herod's nephew. She went on to have a son after 2 months' union. That son was called the Saviour King and son of the living God, as were all Egyptian kings according to the legend of Dionysus, brother and husband of Isis. Dionysus is born on the 25th of December in a manger. He is the son of Zeus and a mortal virgin. He is announced as a future king and saviour of his people. His birth is also announced by a new star. 3 wise men visit him and his mother with gifts from kings. He has 12 servants, turns water into wine, saves with amnesties and performs miracles. He is the god of wine, son of Zeus, and his body is celebrated with bread and his blood by wine. Hence, I believe the Catholic Church does not want the much maligned Cleopatra, maligned deliberately by them, to be found. Who knows what might be buried with her, including perhaps the planned fate for her 2 sons with Octavian. They, oddly, being lost to history. Octavian went to great lengths to do the best he could for all her children. But he did a lot more. According to Suetonius, Paulinus, the historian's account of Octavian's burial of Cleopatra, Octavian declared he allowed them both the honour of burial, and in giving orders that the mausoleum should be finished. Now this is an incredibly telling statement indeed, because there was only one temple, mausoleum and memorial begun but not finished, being Cleopatra's father's temple complex he had started. The Temple of Hathor at Dendera. It actually makes sense that her father and she built their temple complex to the south, as North Egypt was quite earthquake prone. So if you want it to last, then build near Luxor, that was well preserved. Also, to build in Alexandria would have been a lengthy disruption to that city and may have needed demolishing of areas to accommodate her next mausoleum. But not only did Octavian command the mausoleum be finished, it was Octavian who built it and Tiberius who finished it. Octavian is carved on the wall of the Temple of Hathor, planning it. Also, many other Caesars later visited it and had their visit carved there, along also visiting and leaving gifts, being Claudius, Caligula, Nero, Trajan, and Marcus Aurelius, to name a few. That they visited and presented gifts at the temple tells me that they were paying tribute to the dead queen and Caesarion at their tomb, symbolised by the carvings of them on the temple wall of Hathor, as only those two are carved on the wall. We see this act even today when floral wreaths are placed on the steps or against the walls of shrines of remembrance in honour and tribute of the fallen. And whilst I suppose this is not totally evidential, do consider how much effort was made, including travelling all the way there to do tributes to her and Caesarion, and why there. I then find all of that effort of travelling there much more than a mere coincidence. In my view, it is definitely somewhere to consider for investigation, being that she and Caesarion could be buried, having been secretly taken south to that memorial and mausoleum to be hidden indefinitely. Both Cleopatra and Caesarion's carvings are on the wall, but not her surviving children, because they are not buried there. Now let's do some more analysis. Suetonius' quote states, he allowed them both to be buried there. Is there any reason that those both, as stated, were not Cleopatra and Caesarion? They are the two carved on the wall. Also, that the mausoleum they started should be finished. That mausoleum monument to them at Dendera had been started before in Cleopatra's father's time. Is there any clear evidence that she'd begun a mausoleum in Alexandria? No. Because there certainly is at Dendera, and dedicated to Hathor with a healing bath attached. Even the carving on the wall shows Octavian holding the plans of it, and where did he acquire those? Also, he is depicted measuring out its foundations and casting a handful of dirt into a hole reminiscent of casting a first sod of soil in the act of burial. Plans of the temple he would have received from Cleopatra in his last meetings with her when he became the executor to her well-ordered use. Most obviously, one that Kathleen Martinez-Berry is working on in her quest to find Cleopatra at Tapsaris Magnus is in finding a temple of Isis, as Cleopatra ruled as the goddess Isis, sister wife of Dionysus. But Hathor and Isis are interchangeable. Both Isis and Hathor are goddesses of the other world, goddesses of new birth and reincarnation, whom the dead ones love. Clearly this is a powerful motivation to be depicted buried at the Temple of Hathor, as Dendera with its bath pool of cleansing rebirth. A temple and place are designed to grant Cleopatra and Caesarion safe passage in the next life in the afterworld or afterlife. And with that I rest my case that the Temple of Hathor is a logical, incredible place to justify a lengthy look at least, based on a lot of research, and far from just an informed guess.